And for 2 decades, people believed that there was a group called the Underclass that was characterized by its antisocial behavior. I learned what it is like to be a boxer as a means of understanding how boxers think and feel and act.
You also called the underclass is a social animal.
And this can be dangerous because it makes us forget that there are social forces beyond the interaction that is visible. So the book, The Invention of the Underclass, is a case study in the history of science, the history of sociology.
So, Loïc, welcome to Turkey and our university, and thank you so much for your cooperation, and it is a great speech for today. So recently you have published many books, which is Buluyor in the city, and the other one is the mention of the underclass, also racial domination and the power of ethnographic poverty. We can talk about the 4 titles, and we will publish in the İstanbul Bilgi University Press for these titles. So the first one is the mention of the underclass. But firstly, I would like to ask a question. The other title, Buluyor, which will published next month. So please describe us, or what's your target, or what's the meaning of the bring it to the Buluyor to the city or the Europe urban?
So in this book I try to do 2 things. I try to answer the question, what does Buluyor tell us about the city? And then I try also to answer the question, what does the city tell us about Buluyor? So I revisit Buluyor's early work from his youth, which was centered on colonial Algeria and provincial France in the southwestern region of France, where he grew up. And these early studies of the young Buluyor, so he was 28, 30, 32, they are focused on the decline and the crisis of peasant communities. And he shows, so ostensibly the object of his study are rural village societies. But in fact, he's examining how the forces coming from the city are undermining, are making it impossible for these villages to reproduce themselves in time, and essentially how the city is killing the traditional village. And there are 3 forces that play this role. The first is the school system, the second is the mass media, and the third is the growing economic exchanges between the villages and the cities nearby.
We can also see that you have the comparative sociology with the Goffman and Buluyor. There's a part, the section in this book, Goffman meets and Buluyor. Could you please describe it? What will we see with the meets when the Goffman meets with Buluyor?
So the first part of the book, I recapitulate what Buluyor told us about the city by studying how urbanization changed the village society. In the second part of the book, I focus on a phenomenon I call territorial stigmatization, stigma attached to a particular place. And I draw equally on Buluyor and his theory of symbolic power, and at the macro level. And at the micro level, I draw on the theory of the management of spoiled identities by Erving Goffman. So now Goffman has a theory in which he discusses 3 kinds of stigma. The stigma of the deformities of the body, the stigma of the flaws of moral character, and the stigma of membership in what he called tribes, membership in nationalities, in ethnicities, and in particular groups that are whose value is considered less. He defines stigma as discrediting differentness. So it's a difference that leads other to see you as a lesser being. And so I take Buluyor's sociology of symbolic power and I combine it with Goffman's notion of stigma and how stigma impacts people's behavior. When we encounter a stigmatized person or a stigmatized place, we act differently towards that person. We discriminate against that person, we discriminate against that place. We elaborate an ideology to explain why we behave differently, and this sets a series of social processes in motion that tends to isolate and to punish a stigmatized person or stigmatized places.
The third part is or the marginality, ethnicity, penalty in neoliberal metropolis, and you and the books with the Bourdieu in the city and the city in the Bourdieu. So we can talk about the other titles if we saw the invention of the underclass. So please, for the readers who is unfamiliar to the concept of the underclass, could you explain it briefly, if possible, or draw the lines? Because you said that in the book, underclass is not a class. It's not a class like a subcategory of Marxist history. So what is underclass?
So the book, The Invention of the Underclass, is a case study in the history of science, the history of sociology. It's also a case study in what I called demonology, the study of the social demon. And it's a study that seeks to illustrate the theory of Pierre Bourdieu, his theory of cultural fields, by combining it with the history of concepts of the German scholar Reinhard Koselleck. And so the underclass was a term that dominated the public debate around race and poverty in the United States between 1977 and 1997, and it was a term that took academics by storm, that also diffused in journalism, and that diffused in political and policy debate. And for 2 decades, people believed that there was a group called the underclass that was characterized by its antisocial behavior. And it was a group, so even though the term underclass does not refer ostensibly to ethnicity or race, in reality the term serves to designate the undeserving, dangerous, deviant blacks that whites were afraid of because of the collapse of the ghetto in the 1960s that left areas of intense poverty at the heart of cities, and whites, as well as middle-class blacks, became very fearful of this population, and they invented the term underclass not just to describe, but also to stigmatize this group and to push it to the side. And in a sense, the book, The Invention of the Underclass, illustrates some of the principles developed in Bourdieu in the city, particularly the role of symbolic power and the role of stigma, and applies it to the story of the underclass, this demon in the city that was believed to terrorize the inhabitants and destroy the very neighborhoods in which the underclass was said to live.
Demon in the City, we choose this name for the Turkish title. It's like the Spanish one is the same, El Diablo en la Ciudad.
Yes.
I think. Yeah.
Yes.
So you are chasing after an urban chimera, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You also called the underclass is a social animal. In this title.
So in a sense, the people who talk about the underclass, so there's a sort of collaboration, interchange going on, circulation. The term and the discourse of the underclass circulates from the academic world into the world of policy. Politics and philanthropy, and into the world of journalism. And the different protagonists of this story, they use the term in slightly different ways, but the very fact that the term circulates between these three worlds gives it authority. Academics talk about the underclass because journalists and politicians talk about the underclass. The politicians talk about the underclass because academics and journalists talk about the underclass. And the journalists, they believe in the existence of the group because they hear politicians and academics talking about it. And so this is how we see an urban myth emerge, as if people were talking about a strange animal living in the city that is dangerous, that is mysterious, that is difficult to catch and difficult to tame.
And difficult to describe?
And difficult to describe, and so there's an effort, particularly among social scientists. So philanthropic foundations fund research on the urban underclass, and sociologists who are eager to get money to do research, they accept the money and they investigate various facets of life in the remnants of the ghetto, and they produce masses of empirical data. And then, so they say these are data on underclass neighborhoods. So there's the underclass, the population, but there's also neighborhoods that are labeled as underclass neighborhoods. And so as the social scientists measure this supposed reality, the belief in the existence of a group rises, because, you know, if you can measure it, there must be something there.
Yeah, I also wonder that what's the meaning of the 9 lives of the underclass? So we can think about that underclass cannot be killed, or underclass is not dead. So what's the meaning of this, the 9 lives of underclass?
So by the expression 9 lives of the underclass, I refer to the fact that after the discourse of the underclass vanished, and pretty much disappeared from particularly the more advanced sectors of research, policy, and journalism, it resurged in other countries, particularly today in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, some in Germany, although German sociologists were, after a period where they were seduced by the term, they thought that, you know, there is no such population in German cities, so we will abandon the term. It has also resurged in China to designate illegal migrants coming from rural countryside into the city. So even as the underclass seems to have died in the United States, it continues to live multiple lives in other countries. And even in the United States, it has died, but not completely. For instance, there are 2 very important professors who are very prominent scholars who teach at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and at the University of Stanford on the West Coast. And today they teach a course on the urban underclass.
So we can think this concept with other countries, or applied other countries, right? Other parts of the world. The concept of the underclass.
So in other countries they use the term, but for instance in Scandinavian countries they use the term underclass to designate immigrant population, non-Western immigrant population, so migrants or refugees who very often have been concentrated in social housing estates, and whom the Norwegian or the Swedish fear. So there's a discourse of fear and a discourse of otherness that has developed around these populations, and they are presented as deviant, as culturally different in a way where they will not be able to be assimilated. They are pictured as involved in crime, and so much of the discourse of the urban underclass in the United States that diffuse the belief that African Americans who live at the heart of the city are, you know, unemployed, living on welfare, have a single-parent family, fail at school, commit crimes. So we find many of these same properties transferred and resurging in Sweden in particular, in Norway also, in Denmark. And so the discourse of the underclass is imported to stigmatize and to stigmatize a population that is seen as incapable of mixing with the rest of society and representing a threat for the integrity of the national body.
I have a question, but very personal. You still interest in the street science? I mean the boxing?
So am I still interested in boxing?
Boxing, so like as a sport?
Yeah, so in 2022, I published a new edition of the book Body and Soul, which
it's anniversary.
So it's an anniversary. It's the 20 year of of the publication of the English language version. And so what I did for this post.
We say that sorry for interrupt. This book has been published by the Boğaziçi University Press. The Body and Soul.
So the original version.
The original version.
The original version. But so the new anniversary edition has an extra 130 pages of text. So it's like a new book. And in the postface, I explain how I did the research and how I developed the notion of the concept of habitus from Pierre Bourdieu, which designates our embodied capacity and ways of thinking or feeling, of acting. I explain how I used habitus both as the object, I try to explain the habitus of the boxer, but also as a method. I learned what it is like to be a boxer as a means of understanding how boxers think and feel and act in the social world. And then the second part of the postface, I tracked down my friends from the gym 30 years later, and I did interviews with all of them, and I tell the story of what happened to them in the 30 years after they left the gym. I ask them, how do they look back at their life as a professional boxers? Do they believe that boxing was a positive force? And universally, so none of them won a title, won any money, so they had aspirations to become champions, but none of them really did very well in boxing. But all of them explain that boxing was a positive force in their life, that it taught them discipline, that it taught them dignity, that it valorized them, that it gave them a sense of camaraderie, of having a brotherhood with the other boxers. And then at the conclusion of the book, I have a little section called a note on pugilistic piety. And I explain how piety, being pious, it means to be religious. And so I explain how 30 years later, when I look back at my experiences, and to help me write the postface, I would go on YouTube and I would look at the fights from the great era of the 1970s, the fights between Ali and Fraser, Ali and Foreman, and so on. And in order to get back into the atmosphere of boxing, and as I watched this fight, I was both admirative of the extraordinary achievement of these athletes, and then in another way, I was horrified.
That's what is inspiring.
I was horrified. And so I try to reflect about why is it that I was not horrified when I was in the gym with the boxers. And I think the difference, and why is it that I'm horrified 30 years later when I am laying in my bed and looking at my tablet at the fight. And I think the difference is that when I was in the gym, I experienced boxing through my full senses, with touch, with smell, with sight, with hearing, and so it was a fully embodied experience of the sport. And when 30 years later I watched the fights on YouTube, I only relate to boxing through the gaze, through the eyes. And the eyes are a more intellectual, and they are a more distant way of relating to the world. And I think the two different ways in which I related sensually to the craft of boxing explain why I've lost my pugilistic piety.
This work is so inspiring for me. So, the last one. I would like to ask to you that for the other titles which will be published by the Istanbul University Press. First one is the racial domination, and the other one is the poverty of ethnographer poverty. Could you please some words? Could you say some words for these titles?
So first, let me start with the poverty of the ethnography of poverty. It is an exercise in ethnographic epistemology, that is, trying to understand what are the foundations of fieldwork, ethnographic observation. And I try to So I characterize ethnography as a form of inquiry in which the sociologist or the anthropologist or the political scientist is embedded into the social milieu that he studies, and also studies the phenomenon in an embodied way, with using their full sensorium, their sight, their hearing, their sensuality. And I argue that a good ethnographer is somebody who captures the social world through their whole body. So I characterize ethnography as embodied and embedded social inquiry, and then I discuss some traps, some fallacies, some difficulties or flaws that ethnographers commonly commit, or some traps in which they fall. And I try to discuss these common flaws of ethnography. For instance, the flaw of interactionism, wanting to reduce everything to what is visible in the interaction between the people that we observe. And this can be dangerous because it makes us forget that there are social forces beyond the interaction that is visible, invisible social forces like position in an institution, relations of power, that we can't observe in the interaction, but that play a role in shaping the interaction. So I work my way through 5 difficulties. They have complicated name, but I try to explain them. So there's interactionism, inductivism, presentism, interpretativism, and populism. So let me give the example of populism.
Sure.
People who do field work, who are close to their subject of study, they tend to want to give glory to the people they study. They want to show them in a good light. They want to valorize, especially if it's stigmatized group. They want to give dignity to the people they study, and this leads them to make mistakes, of observation. So that's an example of the fallacy of populism. And so I discuss these different fallacies, and I give examples of how to avoid making them, how to avoid making these mistakes. So in a sense, the book is something of a epistemological reflection. Sometimes I call it a critique of ethnographic reason, but also it's very concrete. It gives examples from the study of urban poverty, and not only examples of the mistakes that were made, but also examples of how to avoid these mistakes. So it has a negative side, but it also has a positive side of teaching students ways of avoiding committing these common fallacies of what I call ethnographism. Now, the book, Racial Domination. So in a sense, racial domination is similar to the poverty of the ethnography of poverty in that it is also an effort to clarify the study of race and ethnicity, to identify the common flaws, identify the obstacles towards studying racial domination. It provides a clear definition of domination as the extraction of the compliance of a subordinate population, which is defined and characterized in a biologized manner or naturalized manner. And so I define racial domination clearly. I work my way through common obstacles in the study of racial domination. For instance, the most important obstacle is treating the United States as a central case and as a barometer by which to measure the other cases. And I show that the United States, the trajectory of racial domination, particularly the relationship between the white settlers and African American slaves or the Native Americans, I show that the United States case is very much an outlier, very much unusual. And so we cannot construct a sociology of domination that will embrace the whole world if we start from a case that is an outlier. So I work my way through the obstacles towards a good sociology of racial domination, and then I develop a conceptual framework. I argue that to understand racial domination, we have to understand the dialectic between classification and stratification. Classification is the way we organize people and put them in boxes and label the boxes, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, etc. Or, you know, in Turkish society, there are labels that refer to the region from which people come. And so that's the racial classification. But then we also distribute resources differently to the people in these different boxes, and that's racial stratification. And so I develop this framework of the interaction between racial classification and racial stratification. And then I develop what I call the 5 elementary forms of racial domination. I argue that any racial phenomenon can be broken down into its constituent elements, and these elements are stigma, the fact of devaluing a particular population, treating it as inferior. So stigma, there's also discrimination, treating this population differently because it is a population that is stigmatized. Segregation, which is distributing people differently in physical space, as with, for instance, segregated neighborhoods. There's also a form of racial domination that I call seclusion, of which the 3 forms are the ghetto, the reservation, and the camp. And then there's the 5th form of ethno-racial domination, which is peculiar because it is both a form of racial domination in its own right, and it is also a means to bolster and to reinforce and to impose the other forms of racial domination, and that's violence. Racial violence is a very central phenomenon in the making of racial domination, and so I provide a framework for understanding the different forms and the different dynamics of racial violence. And then I use examples, so then the rest of the book travels to the United States and uses this framework to understand the regime of racial domination in the in the segregationist south of the United States, called Jim Crow.
Which Jim Crow will be published apart from racial domination in French language, right?
Yes. So Jim Crow, there are 2 versions. There's a short version that is in the book Racial Domination, and there's also a long version
in the French language.
That is, and then forthcoming also in many other languages: Spanish, Portuguese.
Maybe
Italian,
Turkish,
and maybe one day Turkish. I'm just now discussing the contract of translation with the German. So, and then eventually it will come out also in English because it's a much longer. So to go back to racial domination, there's 2 theoretical chapters and then 2 empirical chapters that are case studies that illustrate the theory in the first part of the book. The first case study is the study of racial domination in the south of the United States in the late 19th century up until the middle of the 20th century. And then the second chapter is the study of the extraordinary explosion of incarceration in the United States at the end of the 20th century and the early 21st century. That raises the question, why did the United States become the world leader in incarceration, and why did the prison population become racialized, primarily capturing young black men and young Latino men? And so I use the framework of racial domination, classification and stratification, and the 5 forms of elementary domination to understand racialized incarceration in the 20th century. And then I conclude the book with some reflections on social epistemology and race, but also on race and justice. And I try to argue that there are 2 ways of moving towards racial justice, using again the framework of classification and stratification. There's in the order of classification, to move towards social justice is to decrease in particular the stigma attached to membership in particular ethno-racial categories. So the movement towards racial justice is destigmatization. And in the order of stratification, the movement towards racial justice is the movement that decreases the penalty the material penalty that people pay for being the member of a particular group. And this framework, you could use this framework for moving towards social justice generally, for class justice. You could argue that to move towards social justice in general, you need to decrease the stigma attached to being member of the subordinate category, and you need to decrease the material penalty attached with being a member of a subordinate category.
This one also sounds interesting. So we can end now. Do we have any last words, or we can end the interview for now?
So I want to tell the viewers of this video that I'm grateful for the interest that Turkish social scientists have showed for my work, and I want to thank Bilgi University Press for publishing many of my books together, because the advantage of having the books with the same press is that it shows the coherence of the work and how one work helps to move into the next. And in particular, I think it shows in the trajectory of my work a movement towards a more analytical sociology, which is characterized by epistemological clarity, conceptual precision, and empirical acuity. And I hope that I try to argue for these three characteristics in social science, and I hope that to a small degree I show how it can be done. But that's for the reader to judge. That's not for the author.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a great speech for today. I think this will be published by the Urban Research Center via YouTube. And thank you for the books, which are very inspiring for us, for me and for the publisher, İstanbul University Press. Thank you all.
Thank you.